So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shelley Wong, and I'm a faculty member in the Asian American Studies program and the Department of English here at Cornell, or I should say soon to be the Department of Literatures in English. However, it's as a member of the board of the Institute for Comparative Modernities that I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's conversation on anti-racism, activism, and institutional change. So let me begin by thanking the Institute's administrative manager, Ashley Stockstill, for all her efforts in coordinating this session. And I would also like to acknowledge that this event, albeit a virtual one, remains located, nevertheless, on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, and that the history of that dispossession remains a live issue. As the director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program, Professor Kurt Jordan has noted in a blog post on the website of the Cornell University and Indigenous Dispossession Project, quote, "Cornell has a moral obligation to acknowledge that its origins were based on a continental scale program of Indigenous dispossession and has that obligation to educate its faculty, staff, students, and the general public about this history and why it requires action in the present." And it's in the spirit of a belated reckoning with histories of inequality in all its forms that today's session proceeds. And the very term anti-racism in the title of this session retrieves a history of struggle against racism, a history that has been variously sidelined and submerged as a result of the ascendancy of discourses of first multiculturalism and then later diversity. Within institutions of higher education, these discourses have effectively obscured the complex and systemic ways in which racism and other forms of inequality are lodged in institutions of higher education. And today's session is really part of an effort to recover, and to put into play the agonistic element of a struggle against racism within an institution that, by virtue of the stability and regularity that makes it even recognizable as an institution, okay, that institution cannot admit the prospect of instability. Right. And so with this in mind, it's my great pleasure to introduce a group of speakers who have committed themselves to precisely destabilizing those structures of inequality that have become institutionalized. And we're fortunate to have with us today Professor Russell Rickford, who probably most know in terms of whose intellectual and political commitments have never been strangers to each other. Professor Rickford is an associate professor of history at Cornell University. He specializes in African-American political culture after World War II, the Black radical tradition, and transnational social movements. His book, We Are an African People, Independent Education, Black Power, and the Radical Imagination, received the 2016 Hooks Institute National Book Award and the 2017 Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Foundation Award. The Hooks Institute National Book Award is given to an author whose book best furthers understanding of the American Civil Rights Movement and its legacy. He's also the author of Betty Shabazz, A Life Before and After Malcolm X, a co-author of Spoken Soul, The Story of Black English, and the editor of Beyond Boundaries, The Manning Marable Reader. And he's currently working on a book about Guyana and African-American radical politics in the 1970s. Integral to his intellectual work is Professor Rickford's activism in concert with organizations such as Black Lives Matter, Ithaca, the Tompkins County Worker Center, the Multicultural Resource Center, and the Democratic Socialists of America. And on campus, he has worked with student groups such as Black Students United, Climate Justice, People of Color, Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Cornell Coalition for Justice in Palestine. And joining in the conversation today, we have the following participants, and I'll only introduce them in the briefest of terms at this point because they'll each be saying more about their individual work, their individual activist work, and they'll be saying more about the kinds of questions and issues that have been prompted by their work. All right. And I'm going to be introducing them in the order in which they'll be speaking. Huang is a graduate student in the Department of Comparative Literature and examines or does comparative work on African, African American, and Asian American comparative issues. Jessica Rodriguez is a major in the Department of English, and as I mentioned, soon perhaps to be the Department of Literatures in English. Max Greenberg is a student in the College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in math and economics. Kevin Zong is a senior in the government department in the College of Arts and Sciences. Krinal Thakkar is a student in the Biology and Society program and the Department of Psychology. And Bwesigye is a graduate student in English. I won't explain the rest of that. All right. So on that note, I'd like to pass it along to my colleague and co-moderator, Professor Derek Chang, a faculty member in the Department of History and the Asian American Studies program, and whose scholarship focuses on comparative analyses of Asian American and African American entanglements in the US context. So I pass it over to Professor Chang.
Great, thank you, Shelley. Thanks for those introductions and that wonderful introduction to today's panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing what I'm sure will be a robust conversation, both among the panelists and then with the panelists and members of the audience. So I'm hoping we'll have somewhere around a half an hour towards the end of the program for those of you who have been generous enough with your time to join us today to pose questions and to engage with these incredible people on our panel. I'll have some comments after we hear from our panelists as a way of maybe hopefully trying to frame that conversation a little bit. So in order to move forward, why don't we start with Kun? Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley and Derek and the organizers for this opportunity to talk about anti-racism, activism, and institutional change here. And I sort of consider my role here to learn from more seasoned activists. And what I would talk about is not so much like a whole description of like what I have done, but rather some reflections and unresolved questions coming out of those experiences. And as Shelley mentioned, I'm a PhD student in comparative literature, working on comparative race theories. And I'm working on a dissertation that examines how Blackness is translated and constructed in modern Chinese culture. And I was born in Guangzhou, China, and did my undergrad in Hong Kong. And those personal experiences significantly shaped my political engagements in both academic and non-academic or so-called activist ways. So for example, living with racism in China made me devote to the research that I'm currently doing, and also studying in Hong Kong at the time of political turmoil and social movements, when we had to sort of make the everyday decision to either go to class or go to protest, and sometimes even to go to class at the protest site because our professors and colleagues, classmates are there. So those experiences definitely shaped my understanding of the powers, but also the limitations of being a scholar or being in the academia. And to be honest, like I noticed on the poster, we are sort of labeled as student activists, but I really haven't explicitly consider myself to be a proper activist. It sounds very flattering to me because I feel like I've been working with activists and supporting activists. But now I think of it, yeah, maybe that also counts activism, that binary of who's activist and who's not activist is actually not like that. So I'm trying to sort of conceptualize the parts of my experience that may count as activism as really stemming from the profound dissatisfaction with how things are, and also the accompanied empowering drive to do something different, to make things better, and with other like-minded people. And this kind of dissatisfaction and desire are also closely connected to the world that we experience. And that means other people suffering, their dissatisfaction, their visions, and a community's readiness to make some change. And I believe this is maybe also the reason why anti-racist work seems to become more urgent on more people's agenda, and thinking about institutional change, and maybe perhaps the reason that we are even having this roundtable here. And what we are doing in our department, with some other grad students and faculty members, like concretely speaking, is that we're organizing a series of workshops on anti-racist pedagogy in the effort to put into action the anti-racist statement that we published earlier in the summer. And I think many of those who participated in the events would agree it's a very liberating experience. The social space that we created to reflect on and challenge existing pedagogical practices, what we put into our syllabi, and to air concerns and also people's own struggles, felt long overdue. And as this is something that is quite new, in the sense that is organized both by students and faculties, and like in response to like anti-racism in very concrete ways, I guess like nobody sort of know what's the right way to do it. So we are experimenting, like improvising. And of course, a further question is, how do we embed these reflections and reforms in more sustained, enduring ways, so that they're not just like the feel-good moments about, oh, we're doing this like at this time. The last point that I want to make is about being an international student, and also how I think that shapes my political engagements in sometimes very complex and ambivalent ways. There's definitely the wider transnational network of community or support of all kinds of engagements, but on the flip side, the world that I experienced is also very stretched out. So sometimes like the virtual or transnational connections feel closer and more urgent, while the locals feel more foreign. And also being a non-US citizen, especially from a country that is not currently on good terms with the US, feels like living on borrowed time. It's like you don't know when your world will be taken from you, and you probably like at some point be thrown back to another world that has already drastically changed since you left. So it's like looking at the expiration date of my visa and I-20 and realize like the likelihood that, oh, at this point I may not even be like working on my dissertation or something like that. So that's the, like, I guess the structural and psychological forces that I guess make some international students or foreign workers like choose a more cynical or like the conservative path of just focus on, so what is the safest gain here, and to shy away from doing something that do not add to their chances of survival. So I guess like that is like that kind of configurations keep producing the figure of like the hardworking immigrants, or not even immigrant, but like the foreign worker here. And I also noticed the Cornell policies, the administration's, this Trump administration's policy targeting international students or foreign workers are not they do not tend to be framed in political or racial sense, but rather as an administrative or legal problems at the level of international relations that the university have to deal with. So here I don't want to generalize the effect of like the anti-immigrant policies of the US, but I do believe like they offer very concrete challenges, but perhaps also some opportunities to think about campus activism and institutional change. So that's all I have to offer for the moment. I'm looking forward to learning from others. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Kun. And I'm sure we'll get to hear in much more detail the work that you're doing, and I look forward to hearing you engage with your fellow panelists as well. Jessica, we hear from you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me just fine. So I am actually a doctoral candidate in the Department of English working on African American and Caribbean literature. And Kun, thank you so much for your comments. I'm hoping I can pick up on thinking about what an anti-racist pedagogy and curriculum at Cornell, and add some thoughts based on some of the work that I've already done with my department, and also the work that we're co-organizing to do as we're moving through the semester and beyond. So I'm going to speak from the experience and practice of having developed, piloted, advocated for community engagement, both within and without the classroom, and having worked with amazing community leaders and organizers like Ms. Jamila Walida-Simon with 4-H, Ms. Phoebe Brown with the Multicultural Resource Center and Alliance of Families for Justice, and Ms. Leoke Lee at 4-H Urban Outreach. I mean, these leaders have taught me an incredible amount about caring for and protecting other people through the things that I can teach, the demands that I can make, and the resources that I can share. So, I mean, if they're out there, thank you. You know, y'all have been an incredible inspiration. So I'm going to spend a lot of this time talking about what community engagement has meant for me and the reasons why I have and we should all continue to pursue it. So the first being that community engagement has been an opportunity to focus on local needs and issues by partnering with specific organizations, as I have with 4-H Urban Outreach. In the classroom and our research alike, this focus breeds opportunity for generative discussions around on-the-ground topics like food insecurity, race, class, and literacy rates, prison reform, and reintegration, which helps situate our work, no matter how small, in a long history of affecting collective change. So this class, my class, is focused on like Black feminist history, for example, and politics, help students understand that whether you're the one cooking the pancake breakfast or the one holding the megaphone, or in our case, hanging out or reading with kids, is all necessary work. So students have been able to frame their learning and career prospects according to larger social-oriented issues, so that when they graduate, they seek to actively address community and not just corporate needs, which is always the temptation, right? The second is that community engagement is also meant thinking about engagement as opposed to service as an ongoing conversation between the university and the public in ways that are non-extractive and non-patriarchal. Ms. Jamila and Ms. Phoebe, for example, visited our classroom to speak with students about their relationships to the community, talk about how they got into advocacy and what that work has looked like in terms of the emotional tax, the labor, the compensation, right? Thinking about how we can develop ethical and equitable connections with community organizations and what it means to listen before we act, right? To listen before we act. So third, community engagement has been an active formation of mutual reciprocal relationships between the university and the community. This means not only providing funding, but also substantial enrichment. My students, the majority of which were students of color, got to serve as positive mentors for the West Village youth, while experiencing opportunities for community despite being at a predominantly white institution. So when we talk about mutual relationships, we're talking about making sure communities benefit from the resources of the university and our presence as academics in spaces outside Cornell, as much as we, academic scholars, people in this room, benefit from this sort of novelty of actually leaving the institution. And when I say this phrase, the novelty of leaving the institution, it brings me to my last and arguably most important point. Much of the work that I do is situated within the university, in spite of the fact that what I'm most interested in and what I most advocate for is community engagement within and without the classroom. I say this because the greatest potential, I believe, of community engagement is its ability to transform the culture of our university and our practice as scholars, and that is exactly my ambition. When we do community engagement and we do it well, it necessitates that we prioritize something other than the accumulation of our own knowledge and prestige, which is contrary to what academia teaches us and encourages us to do. In fact, as I have become increasingly involved in university activism beyond community engaged teaching, I more and more hear the phrase, "It'll look good on your job, on your CV. It's great for jobs." As if my value is contingent on accumulated credentials, or I need reassurance that I'm not wasting my time. Yes, we should be recognized for our labor, although we all know what the university does with the service section of our CVs. But as a rule, the work that we do should always already seek to have material effects beyond the CV. So in closing, I want to leave you all with a statement from a report on the state of the department. It was written and published by the Radical Caucus, a group of graduate students, English graduate students, in 1998. And it reads, quote, "The connection between progressive scholarship and progressive ethics has worn increasingly thin. There are no necessary or reliable correlations. This combination of apparently progressive scholarship and unreflective regressive ethical practice is one we can avoid at Cornell only if we commit as individuals and as a collective to serious reevaluation, self-critique, and a commitment to intervention. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Jessica. That was gives us a lot to think about. Max, would you like to contribute now, please?
Yeah. First, I just wanted to thank Professor Russell Rickford for organizing this panel discussion that we're having today, because I think it comes at a very critical time for anti-racist activism on campus. Student organizing at Cornell, at least among undergraduate students, has never really had a particularly clear conception, I don't think, of how our work here fits into or relates to broader nationwide or even worldwide struggles against those systems whose local manifestations our work on campus is trying to target. So in particular, monopoly capitalism, Western imperialism, settler colonialism, and so on. But to an extent, the familiar rhythm that our work had right up until March of this year, when the coronavirus pandemic reached New York State, experiencing those successes and failures of each new exciting campaign that we undertook was perpetually forestalling a much needed reevaluation of some really serious questions of framework, objectives, and strategy on our part. Now that our ability to organize in person has been severely curtailed, the time for that reevaluation, I think, is now, and it will be conducted through conversations just like the one that we're having today. As for my personal background, I'm the president of both Cornell Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the main pro-Palestinian group on campus, and Cornell Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the only Jewish organization on campus which is opposed to the ongoing Israeli occupation and colonization of Palestine. As such, my main connection to issues of anti-racist organizing on campus is through actively supporting the Palestinian national liberation struggle in whatever way I can from Ithaca, New York. And although Palestine is geographically very far away, over 5,000 miles away, the relevance of their struggle is much nearer to us at Cornell. Just to give a few examples, on an institutional level, Cornell is heavily invested in the Israeli occupation through its partnership with the Haifa-based university Technion IIT, which shares our Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island. Technion, of course, is a key player in the Israeli arms industry, helping develop the automated D9 Caterpillar bulldozer, which the IDF uses to flatten Palestinian houses in East Jerusalem, and also partners with Elbit Systems, which is a security company based in Haifa as well, which operates surveillance towers both in the West Bank of Palestine and the Tohono O'odham nation in Arizona, which is occupied by the United States. More broadly, because America and Israel share parallel histories as settler colonial powers, the Palestinian struggle has developed a unique bond with the liberation struggles led by colonized people in the United States. And this is a bond that leaders such as Angela Davis, Dennis Banks, and Kwame Ture have all recognized and spoken and written about. So the struggle for a free Palestine 5,000 miles away in the Middle East is just as germane to us as Cornellians, and just as germane to this conversation as the struggles for Black and Native liberation and self-determination. And that's the perspective I'm hoping to bring to this conversation today.
Great, thank you for that Max. Kevin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin. First of all, I just wanted to echo something Kun had said earlier, which is, I'm really excited just to be here today for an opportunity to kind of learn and listen from these great panelists, and then also hopefully everyone else in the audience who might be submitting questions or challenging us to different topics. I think sometimes I struggle to consider myself as an activist. That word carries a lot of weight, and I don't take it lightly. And I think I have had the opportunity to be in situations where I've been able to be involved with activism and see activism happen. But I don't want to go so far as to just claim credit or to misplace my role in those. A little bit of background about myself. My hometown is Charlottesville, Virginia, which I'm sure is a bit, well, I mean, it raises an eyebrow, at least certainly for me, given that a couple days before coming up to Cornell for my freshman year, we had those race riots in our town, and places which I have beloved memories of became scenes of racial violence and hatred. So it's been a challenge, honestly, ever since I got into college, to think about what does it mean to deal with racism on a level that is very personal, when it affects friends and family of yours, when it affects local businesses of yours, when it also, I think, kind of goes beyond that and becomes nationalized and sensationalized, right? When President Trump decided to say that there were good people on both sides, he wasn't talking about some people that were on the news. He was talking about people that were in my town. And so just from that start, it really shaped and kind of really put me on a different trajectory in terms of how I thought about activism. It's been challenging because, in all honesty, Charlottesville is not a very diverse place. I went to high school with a predominantly white population. Most of my friends were white. And, you know, I also went to an evangelical Chinese conservative church. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity for me to really engage in an activism that I felt really drawn to. But that's where this year has been a very interesting kind of turn for that. COVID-19 has provided an opportunity to have time to reckon with ourselves and with many, many different things. But also institutionally, if we're talking about institutions, you know, COVID-19 is a time where economics are at the forefront of concern. And so obviously there's a lot of tension that currently exists right now. And it's opened up the doors to what I think I've discovered is a really important part of activism to me, which is the grassroots conversations. Just, you know, not necessarily the stuff that we recognize or we quantify on a daily basis, but what we actually do with our free time and the relationships we build and what those mean. It's been an interesting summer, to say the least. After the George Floyd protests and the horrific killing of George Floyd, you know, some of my white friends were very uncomfortable just having me talk about it openly because politics was not something we breached. And they felt as white males that it was very, very difficult for them to take up space. So we ended up having a series of hour-long conversations just about what it means to be an ally, but also be benefiting from dominant spaces. And that's a conversation I don't think is limited to white males. I think that's a conversation that all of us should be having. You know, I am a privileged person in an elite university, and that's something I think it's easy to forget. You know, we live in this bubble that is Cornell, but I mean, all of us are very privileged to be here in the first place, to have access to education, resources, and professors like these that have organized this conversation on a daily basis. I take that for granted all the time. And I think it opens up the door to having an opportunity to say, so what does that mean, right? What kind of thing can we do with that? But also, how do we understand our role being somewhat, well, actually literally placed in an institution that perpetrates many of the things that we are actively fighting against? So these are some questions that I obviously have been wrestling with since the beginning of the pandemic. And, you know, on campus, I've been involved with several really cool projects. So the Cornell Prison Education Program, where we go into BTAs for classes in local prisons before, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic shut all that down. We're hoping to get back next semester, but we'll see. I also was able to do a lot of research on risk preference and protests. And it was really cool to see my research actually come to life in June, when all of a sudden millions of Americans everywhere said that enough was enough and that it was time to take a stand against racism. And I've also been involved with the Asian American Pacific Islander in Philanthropy Group, where I've been doing research on the invisibility of certain Asian American struggles in the media. And again, I think that research has highlighted for me what kind of privilege that I have being in an institution like Cornell, and also illuminating what it means to have those conversations and to try to change the culture of this institution without necessarily, you know, completely demolishing or changing it to its entirety.
Great, thank you for that, Kevin. Krinal.
Hi, my name is Krinal. I'm a sophomore in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm a first-generation immigrant. So I was born in India. I came here when I was 9, and I think I can echo a lot of what Kevin said about, you know, being Asian American in a predominantly white space. So for the majority of my first couple of years here, I was in a predominantly white suburb, and I had a very thick accent, and it was hard to feel it was hard to not be ashamed of where I came from. And at one point I pretended that I did not have an Indian accent and that I'd forgotten my language. And I think that even as a child, that is what predominantly white spaces compel people to do, kind of align themselves and assimilate. Because if you don't do that, then, you know, you get racist remarks, you feel bad about where you come from. And so I think that this summer has also been really interesting for me because I've learned a lot about my culture, and like, you know, I've started to regain pride for where I come from. And I think that I want to echo what Kevin said about that. I also want to echo what Kuhn said about how while I'm not an activist, I don't want that title, I have been involved in activism. And I want to just talk about what I've taken from these experiences rather than just speak about them. So I believe that one of the most important experiences I've had at Cornell is my work at Prisoner Express. I started working there the beginning of my freshman year, and I've learned a lot about what it means to be framed a certain way, have a certain rhetoric be tied to your identity, right? So like when you think of prisoners, you don't think of sympathy, you don't think of advocacy, because they're usually at the bottom of the food chain in terms of having rights, because they're ignored by society, they're criminalized. But I was actually having a conversation with my mentor, Suman, and he brought up a very interesting point. And that question is, what is police and what is criminalized in this country? So many times, like, you know, the news outlets we get criminalize and, you know, dehumanize people who are incarcerated. So we call them prisoners instead of calling them people who are incarcerated, right? So like that right there, that difference just speaks to how dehumanizing rhetoric can shape the way people view them. People are viewed in our community. So I learned a lot about, you know, humanizing people who are usually not even thought about. And one very impactful instance was when I had a conversation with someone who was diagnosed with 4th-stage metastatic cancer. Now, you don't get diagnosed that late. Your pleas were just ignored. And that's what happens in prison. Your cries and your pain is ignored. And that really inspired me to pursue research in prison healthcare. And the things I've learned, for example, how privatized prison healthcare benefits from people, like keeping people in prison sick, and how we don't even hear about these things, and how our tax dollars go into the cruel and unusual punishment that a lot of these prisoners get. They may not have been sentenced to death, but they do end up getting death if they, you know, end up with cancer or with any diseases. So it really inspired me to think about, you know, social determinants of health and how imperialism and colonialism and slavery are embodied in the health and well-being of people of color all the time, in and outside of prison, and how if we don't understand the social determinants of health, we cannot be successful doctors, we cannot be successful lawmakers, because these issues are bigger, they're systemic. And then I started working with Richard Rivera. He works a lot with addressing the homelessness within the Ithaca community. And I just want to put this out there, but I think that we are responsible for causing a lot of this homelessness, because we have the privilege of having a stable income that many times people from Ithaca do not. And so we come into this community and now we've taken up the space and are in part causing this homelessness. On top of that, Cornell has a lot of land that is not used, that is there for aesthetics, that can be used to provide for homes for the people in the community that we occupy, and yet it is not being done. So I want to kind of echo what Kuhn said about the sustainability of this conversation. I mentioned this before too, but I really want this conversation to be more than just a conversation. I want this to be a catalyst for change. I want this to be an inspiration, and I want to learn from my panelists so that I can be an agent of change, so I can maybe try to become an activist instead of just participating in activism. And so I just want to end with saying that, like, my purpose in life is to use my voice, to use my privilege of being in an institution like Cornell to advocate for those who are silenced because of systemic racism. And I'm looking forward to learning from you all about how to do that.
Great, thank you for that. Bwesigye.
Thank you very much for having us. I am very grateful to be in community with everyone, but I want to start by introducing myself. I am in the same cohort as Jessica Rodriguez in the department currently known as English, that we hope will not be known as English in a few weeks. I am from Uganda, so I'm an international student. Before coming to Cornell, I followed the student protests that were happening in South Africa, in the UK, that were calling for the decolonization of universities in those places. So I came to Cornell with the understanding that the world was changing in a way, at least at university level, that people were thinking about decolonization seriously, that people were questioning the imperial white supremacist basis of these institutions. So that's the background with which I came to Cornell, right? Having been at Cornell now for the last 4 years, I have realized, okay, not that I've just realized, but I've seen increasingly how the very mundane things that happen reinforce the racist basis of the world, right? So being in a classroom, coming from an African country, Uganda, teaching about African literature to students that are mostly educated in the US, and that means a lot, right? Being educated in the US, the narrowness of American education or United States education. So even if, Uganda is led, mismanaged by a neo-colonial dictator who's been in power for the last, he's making 35 years in power very soon. So in a way you think, oh, I'm at Cornell, it's an Ivy League university, and therefore I'm far off from this violence that is happening in Uganda, right? And then you come to this classroom and your presence alone becomes an activist act. You don't have to open your mouth to say anything. Just your presence itself becomes an activist act, because you have to deal with the institutional legacies of racism that exist in that room. So the knowledge that you bring as a graduate student instructor, the knowledge that you bring is unwelcome. So first you have to deal with those institutional challenges, right? You have to explain why you are teaching people about African crime fiction. And you have to engage with these images they have of Africa that are of course informed by imperialism. So even before you open your mouth to share, you have to deal with that, and you sort of don't have a choice. You don't have a choice between being an activist and not being an activist. Your classroom itself, given the nature of the research that you're doing and the course that you're teaching, is already an activist act. And as Jessica has already mentioned, this doesn't get recognized because you're in one way fighting for space for this knowledge that you come with, but also you want the students to see this as important, right? So then it becomes you start to persuade them that this is important, on top of persuading the institution that this is important. And so I want to end with the concept that Walter Rodney, the Guyanese radical intellectual, introduced, the idea of a guerrilla intellectual, right? You're just not a student, you're just not an academic. You also are a guerrilla in some way, because you are not wanted. And you're also part of a very oppressive, exploitative, extractive institution. So you have to use guerrilla tactics, right? And for you, it's not just a matter of a job. It's not just about preparing yourself for the job market and building a career. Whatever you are doing in that classroom determines your life. Your life depends on it. And so activism then becomes a way of life. It becomes a practice. And just, I think that's enough, and we're going to talk more.
Great, thank you for that, Bwesigye. That's a really nice place for us to sort of transition to the next portion of our program today. And I was asked to sort of try to kind of pull together the various strands and maybe to pose a handful of big questions as a way of hopefully framing the conversation that will follow. And I want to really sort of truncate that right now because the first portion was running a little longer than we anticipated, and I really want us to have a full conversation and to bring the audience into this. But it strikes me, right, that there are a bunch of maybe binaries or dichotomies or false dichotomies, right, that people have been sort of working through, right, the activist scholar, the on-campus, off-campus, the domestic, and the international, right? Those are sort of things that have been floating around in terms of the conversations, maybe the different scales of the different the ways in which things are interlocking, and so I think that's something to pay attention to. But you know, very broadly, I think we've been hearing bits and pieces, and maybe at an all too superficial level, given the constraints of time and the forum, about kind of the sources of our amazing panelists' activism and activities, right, in their political engagements. And so I'm hoping we can draw out a little more in our conversation, sort of where those come from, right? You know, ideas and experiences, the role of sort of formal curricular things and sort of less formal forms of education, and we've heard hints of that as well. I'm interested also in hearing about what we might assume, but we've heard, again, bits and pieces of, you know, the critique of the institution, right? How does your analysis of the institution, you know, where does that come from, and what sort of politics does that lead you to? And I think you know, this panel is about anti-racism, but as most of us are really aware of, right? Race is sort of connected to other forms of power. So I'm particularly interested in sort of how labor and class, right, in so much as the university is a site of production, all sorts of production, right? In what way does your analysis of race and class connect to your anti-racist activities and engagements? So I think we have lots and lots to talk about, and I really sort of want to maybe just hand it over to Russell to begin our discussion, and hope that the wonderful participants will be able to sort of chime in as they see fit, and maybe I'll try to step back a little bit and hope that this develops organically, and maybe really only sort of jump in to sort of keep time and push things forward a little bit. But I just before I move to Russell, I just want to say I know we've heard a few of the panelists say that they hope something really develops out of this kind of conversation, and I think this is really, we all recognize that this is just a beginning point, right? And I hope that bringing everybody into this virtual Zoom room together and including the attendees will sort of really be just a kind of way to move forward rather than a kind of end into itself. So with that, Russell.
Well, thanks so much, Derek. I feel my role here is mostly just to echo and underscore some of the wonderful things that have already been said. I mean, you yourself have already emphasized one of the things I wanted to emphasize, which is the question of the connections between race and class. And then Bwesigye just now invoked the name of one of my heroes, Walter Rodney, the Guyanese intellectual and activist, and Pan-Africanist and socialist, and in particular, his critical idea of the guerrilla intellectual, right? In terms of his profound understanding of our responsibilities as producers of knowledge, but not just producers of knowledge, but producers of genuine change. So I'm already inspired, and I think we're already cooking here. I did want to just take a moment to thank the organizers. Despite Max's kind words, I'm not an organizer. I'm actually a beneficiary of the hard work that's been done. So I wanted to acknowledge the Institute for Comparative Modernities, and especially Ashley Stockstill Shelley Wong and Derek Chang. This has been already a wonderful conversation. And as always, I'm delighted to learn from students, some of whom I've had the pleasure and the honor of teaching. So just to recap very briefly, Kuhn reminded us of the importance of dissatisfaction and desire and the readiness to make change. Jessica raised the question of how do we rethink, necessary work, and how do we forge non-extractive relationships to the community, and ethical and reciprocal relationships based on mutuality. Max talked about about building solidarity with international struggles against settler colonialism, and especially the exploitation and occupation of Palestine. Kevin talked about how do we understand and act upon our complex relationships to power and privilege. Krinal talked about how do we expose dehumanization and criminalization, and how do we fight systems that impose social death on vast swaths of society, especially those targeted by mass incarceration in the carceral state. And again, Bwesigye talking about how do we confront the imperial white supremacist basis of our institutions, especially when our very presence, right, is seen as disruptive or subversive. So I think that, one of the themes for today is this question of what are the possibilities and limits of institutional change, or what are the opportunities and obstacles of the institution. And I do see today as a real opportunity for self-evaluation, for self-criticism, and for introspection, right? Which I think is a critical part of activism. I did want to take just 3 or 4 minutes to see if I could frame a sort of larger political moment that we find ourselves in, and in which this conversation about the possibilities or obstacles of change unfolds. And first, the opportunities. I want to say something quite obvious, which is I think that we're living in an extraordinary conjuncture, extraordinary moment of transition. I think it was Gramsci that said that, the old world is dying, and the new world is struggling to be born. And within that kind of struggle, I think we see some of the monstrous manifestations, right? The neo-fascism, et cetera, that is intensifying, but also tremendous hope and tremendous possibilities. It's clear that, the sort of prevailing systems, including the phase of capitalism that we've known as neoliberalism, that the failures of those systems are accelerating, that those systems are collapsing. And so we're in the moment of tremendous upheaval and turmoil, but also possibilities for renewal. And I think as part of that renewal, we've seen in recent months and years a reinvigoration and a radicalization of the struggle for Black liberation, much of which has taken the form of Black Lives Matter. So we've seen a radicalization, a re-radicalization of Black Lives Matter, and it's produced within the last several months a really extraordinary moment, right? What I call a kind of spontaneous general strike, a decentralized insurrection that is really global in scale, a massive outpouring of outrage and revulsion. And I think it's important to acknowledge and to think about the depth and the breadth of this movement, of the anti-racist movement. It's been multiracial, it's been youthful, but also multi-generational. But more than anything else, it's been sustained, right? And it's had deeply insurgent and radical elements. And I think what that brings in terms of possibilities and in terms of opportunities, it brings the possibilities for a shift in consciousness, a fundamental shift in consciousness, a lasting shift in political consciousness and understanding. we've seen the popularization of ideas that were formerly very marginalized, right? Very marginalized radical ideas, right? So, I mean, on one hand, the question of defunding, right, the police, but even more importantly, the question of abolition, right? The abolition of police, the abolition of these sort of repressive structures. You know, abolitionists have raised the question of what would it mean, what would it take to build a society in which no one is desperate, in which there's no need for the real or implicit threat of state violence. And so, you know, we're living in an extraordinary time. I like to tell my students, you know, sometimes history slows down and sometimes history speeds up. Sometimes you can have the events of a decade within a single year. And I mean, for better, for worse, I think many of us are feeling that we're living through that such a year right now. But the point is that what was previously, even 6 months ago or 6 weeks ago or 6 days ago, what seemed politically impossible suddenly becomes possible. And that creates possibilities for us to maneuver. For me, what is promising about this moment is that this tremendous, vast uprising against white supremacy and against racism also in many ways has taken on anti-systemic forms, right? So there's been a growing understanding that this entire system, right, whether we call it racial capitalism, whether we call it neoliberalism, that the entire system is rotten, that it cannot reform itself. And this pandemic in many ways has deepened that understanding, right? The sort of obscene responses, state responses to the pandemic, official responses to the pandemic, only sort of underscores the facts that we're living in a failed state. And I mean, I think that more and more people are coming to this understanding, right? I mean, this is sort of ripped the covers off the whole rhetoric of American exceptionalism. And this notion of American democracy as a sort of benevolent force domestically and internationally. That we're living in an obscene society in many ways, right? I mean, both the wealthiest, right, and the most decadent and obscene societies in the history of the world, right? And so that's creating a kind of psychological crisis that can be deeply useful. The realization that we're sort of living in a rapidly collapsing empire that views whole populations as expendable. It's useful because people are coming to the conclusion that a larger transformation is necessary, that a wholesale reorganization of our society is necessary. And I think they're coming to that realization in no small part because of the anti-racist upsurge, right? So I think anti-racism, at least potentially, becomes very closely linked to anti-capitalism. That this sort of racial capitalism analysis opens up possibilities for deeper activism and for deeper change, for real transcending of the politics as usual. I think there are many obstacles. You know, these multiple overlapping crises, they can create this sort of crisis of conscience, a crisis of legitimacy that can lead to real transformation, but they can also be demobilizing. They can be depressing. They can be debilitating, right? So the danger is always in a kind of collective surrender to despair and to political paralysis. Of course, on one hand, the mechanisms of repression and authoritarianism and reaction are intensifying. We've seen the discrediting, the sort of criminalization of dissent. We're seeing proto-fascism, militarization, you know, forces of reaction are on the increase, white nationalists, et cetera. But I think one of the just in closing, one of the real dangers for me, particularly in a place like Ithaca, at a place like Cornell, is liberalism, right? It's not necessarily the right, you know, which we also have to sort of confront, but it's this kind of anti-radical reformist impulse and its capacity to co-opt and to contain and to redirect progressive and radical movements. And I'm not just talking about the Democratic Party, which has rightfully been called the graveyard of movements, right? You know, now you have Biden, you know, who's promising, you know, that nothing will fundamentally change. But liberalism itself and its capacity, its impulse to funnel this sort of popular energy back into electoral politics, right? And it's preaching faith in these sort of clearly failed institutions, and its attempt also to co-opt and to control anti-racism, to define anti-racism as a kind of individual shifts in behavior, this sort of personal self-help approach to anti-racism, as versus a broader collective effort to dismantle structural racism and to confront racial capitalism. So I think preventing liberalism from funneling this popular energy and these insurgencies back into preservation of the status quo and the sort of restoration of norms is one of our main challenges. So I'm looking forward to talking more specifically about the Cornell context, but I think we're off to a great start.
Great, thank you for that, Russell. You know, I'm tempted to sort of shift focus just a little bit to talk about kind of the sources of or to ask our panelists about the sources of their activism. But I think Russell sort of ends there with a kind of discussion of some of the obstacles and the challenges, and implicit within kind of how we understand obstacles and challenges to the kind of activism and the kind of anti-racist work you all have been engaged in is a kind of analysis of the institution, and he brought us very nicely back to Cornell. So I'm wondering if I can just sort of pose the question to the panelists, and hopefully we'll have time to get through this and perhaps maybe another round of questions before we go to the Q&A, about kind of your experiences, the lessons you've learned perhaps as you've engaged in activist or anti-racist work at Cornell. And I know Bwesigye has just sort of talked about that kind of guerrilla, that sort of guerrilla intellectual kind of the presence, right? The very presence. But I'm wondering, you know, quite beyond that, sort of trying to get a sense from you on what your experiences have been as you've engaged with this particular institution, and perhaps maybe broaden out from there. Does anybody, maybe we haven't heard from you in a while. I don't want to put you on the spot. I want to cold call you. That sounds terrible, but since we haven't heard your voice for a while, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, my internet is breaking off a little bit, so I didn't hear like the whole of the questions. But maybe I'll just sort of go with it, with what I've been thinking, like as like others are speaking. So let me know if you cannot hear me, because it's like freezing a bit for me. I've been, like, as a person who work on race and Blackness in an East Asian context, I sort of noticed this tendency of like, okay, this has become like a really like heated topic, and especially like in Asian studies, people are sort of now like, are sort of explicitly like look for such expertise. And for me, it's of course like an opportunity to like really to engage with like people who are like previously like less concerned about these issues. But I also noticed like how like the tendency sort of to what do you call it, like just for as Russell talked about, like liberalism to co-opt these efforts into sort of like a diversity programming of like, oh, we have a race person, or like for this program, or like for this university. And could you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Oh, okay. So yeah, so it's yeah, and without really thinking how, like as an institution or as like a discipline to really embody those critics and criticisms and what kind of, like how can we do differently. So I feel like there's this sort of tension between like having like more forum, like more quantity in terms of like more visibility for anti-racist work, but at the same time it's not, for me, it's not really certain that this is something that people are really considering to embody or like to incorporate in their own work. So it seems more like it's like relegating to, oh, we have the race person on our committee, or we have like putting forth an event that is about maybe anti-Blackness in Asia. But yeah, but of course I also don't want to undermine all those efforts, and I think those are like amazing opportunities to build up and to be sort of taken up by other people and in the future as well. But this sort of what I noticed that I think is quite connected to the previous discussion.
Did anybody else want to respond to that? Anyone?
I mean, I think something that's really interesting about, first of all, what Kun was talking about, but also more generally about the university is, I wanted to go back to something, which is that COVID-19 is an extraordinary set of circumstances. I think this is something Professor Rickford was kind of alluding to, right? The 10 years of events happening within 1 year. And one of the things I think is really interesting is seeing how the university is dealing with financial pressure. Because we're at a point where, well, they need money. And you know, so part of like what's been working in the back of my mind since the beginning of the summer was, you know, is Cornell responding to student demands for social justice more because they want to appease students, because they want to create an environment where they appear as progressive and you know, on the right side of history, or is it a genuine desire for change? Because I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is not just when a policy gets implemented, but what happens once that policy gets implemented, or once the university makes a statement or claim. Where do we go from that? And that's something where I think we have issues with, you know, really seeing lasting institutional change, because the accountability and the significant and necessary institutional support often lacks. And that part is often kind of swept under the rug because the university has made a sweeping statement about racism and, you know, has committed to change, right? So when President Pollock, you know, publishes, you know, an email, a very lengthy email about the steps that the university is planning on taking in response to many of the Black Lives Matter protests and things that students have raised as demands for the university to, you know, to really respond to, that's an encouraging sign. The fact that they even listen is a little shocking to me. You know, maybe that's a bit too cynical to say. But the big question is, what has happened since then? Because institutions rarely give the support to measures that don't actually bring in profit, don't bring in prestige, that really comes into what is necessary, right? Because, you know, so something that I think has been really interesting in you know, taking Professor Wong and Professor Chang's Race and University class is talking about international students. You know, when we bring them in, when we bring people in from marginalized communities or different communities, what kind of institutional support are we providing for them to be able to feel comfortable, to feel integrated, to feel like a member of this community? And the answer is very none oftentimes, right? There's a reason why I come from Charlottesville, where all my friends are white, out of necessity, and come to a university like this, and then all of a sudden, seeing all the Asian people around me are naturally gravitating towards them because there is no institutional support, so just really trying to integrate this community. And so I look at that and how institutions have failed those kind of groups. And I look at policy change and I see the exact same thing. I don't see, you know, Cornell actively giving us updates about how they're evaluating their classes, what they're really doing to make sure that they're incorporating cultural and ethnic aspects into those you know, pedagogies. What are they doing to really illuminate why CUPD exists in the first place and what kind of funding transparency is there, right? Those kind of follow-ups are not being publicly announced the same way that they are announcing, oh, we have done this certain thing. If Cornell was to give the same amount of power and energy towards those follow-ups that they did to that initial announcement, then you could say maybe there is institutional change. Maybe there is a positive trend. But as long as it is just one massive announcement and quiet afterwards, you can see it's almost as if they are trying to appease rather than to change.
Yeah, I kind of want to echo that. I think that when the Trump administration put out that the international students, since the classes will be online, will be deported, for lack of a better word, I think the university, among other Ivy League institutions, came out and stood in solidarity. But again, like, kind of going back to Kevin's point, was that because they actually stand in solidarity, or was it because international students pay the full price of the university, right? And I think that those are like wonderful questions to ask, because they did a follow-up. They said that they were, litigating with fellow institutions and standing in solidarity after they released that statement. But then when you look at like statements like Black Lives Matter, are they actually following up? Are all the professors and teachers and educators actually aware of what the difference between racism and freedom of speech is, and are they placing and creating the right environment for all students of color in their classrooms? Or kind of going back to, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Bwesigye, his point about how sometimes students of color have to also be educators along with being students. And I think that that's something that the university needs to change. I think that we are here for an education. We are not here to educate our fellow peers who may not have had the experiences and have the privilege of being unaware of a lot of the institutional and systemic racism that exists within this country. But it is not our job to educate. We take on that role because no one else is doing it, but it is not our job. We are there to get an education. We are not there to be the educators. So I think that until Cornell takes those steps, I think that a lot of the statements that President Pollock makes are quite meaningless, because their words and their actions do not really reflect and coincide.
Thank you for that, Krinal. Any other thoughts about that? Does anybody want to respond?
Can I just say a word or two about that, Derek? Because it's interesting. I'm just thinking about some of the differences between, and I'm not an old man, but I'm not a young man. So I'm trying to think of some of the differences between when I went to school, when I did my undergraduate work in the 90s, and some of the current students. And it seems to me there's a real, a lot of my students, particularly a lot of my undergrads, there's a real identification, a real close identification with the institution itself. And really sort of internalize this rhetoric of, how do they say, any student, what is it? Any student, any study. I can't even remember the phrase, but it's like etched in the consciousness of so many of my students, which suggests a kind of that's a much older, I guess, diversity and inclusion. Thank you. Any person, any study. A much older sort of diversity and inclusion framework, and a kind of assertion of sort of legitimacy or enlightenment. And I think sooner or later, a lot of, because the students are quite bright, sooner or later they begin to recognize some of the shortcomings in practice. But I almost feel like we should acknowledge from the outset that institutions are amoral, right? Like we sort of project all of these values onto the institute that I guess are sort of aspirational human values. But institutions sort of reflect and in many ways reinforce, right, the values of the larger society. So if the larger society is about militarism and imperialism and racism, then of course, those ideals, those principles are going to be deeply ensconced within these institutions, whatever sort of humane values we try to project onto them. But I think that many students sort of experience this crisis when the institution doesn't appear to live up to these ideals. And look, it's important to acknowledge that colleges and universities are not just spaces of privilege. Certainly they are that in many ways, but they're also sort of in the eye of the crisis, right? They're centers of corporatization. they're sort of centers for the casualization of labor. Of course, we've seen this huge rise in contingent faculty and adjuncts and non-tenure track. So these sort of manifestations of neoliberal policies and the application of the profit motive to these supposedly, social mission-driven institutions that are now in the process of imposing these deep austerity measures, right? I mean, Cornell has been somewhat spared. Right across town at IC, they're in the midst of very, very deep, very punishing cuts. But even right here at Cornell, right, attempts to subvert, graduate student unionization efforts. And of course, as some of you have mentioned, right, colleges and universities are now, far apart from this sort of image that the right likes to project of this sort of, left-wing, factories where we sort of indoctrinate, the students, and we just sort of turn out, Marxist Leninists, right? I wish, right, of course, that the colleges and universities are centers of xenophobia, for places for targeting international students and instructors. And so there's this deep entanglement with militarism and colonialism. Some of us have been involved in the recent anti-racist demands that came out of the faculty and some of the graduate students. Part of our what we were trying to do with that document is to sort of expose and to highlight some of the historical entanglements of the university with imperialism and slavery, and the realities that it was founded on dispossession. Some of the things that Shelley talked about in the beginning. But I think it's also important to understand the ongoing and contemporary and the sort of essential nature of the university, right? These are institutions that are designed to encourage individualism and conformity, right? I mean, whatever the rhetoric about critical thought, I mean, if your purpose, spoken or unspoken, is to reproduce society, is to reproduce the professional managerial class, is to reproduce in some ways the ruling class, or at least a managerial class that can perpetuate that rule, then what you truly want is not necessarily critical thinkers, right? What you want is to produce professionals with a deep sort of personal commitment to that practice, right? To that project of the status quo. So I think that we need to recognize that students are being socialized into a particular order. Not just the students, of course. I mean, the professors as well, right? The professors are a critical element of the professional managerial class. And as you go through graduate school, the graduate students can attest to this. As you go through graduate school, and as you become a prof, which is more and more rare these days, right? As you get this sort of rise in contingent faculty, but you're being socialized into a particular function. And it is certainly not the guerrilla intellectual function that Walter Rodney had in mind. It's really about whatever the sort of particulars of what you teach, how you live in the world and how you function in this institution and in our community, which is far more important in terms of an example to students and in terms of an example for the next generation than the particular contents of your lecture or even of your scholarship. So really, so for me, this conversation has to be about a kind of a deep self-criticism and a deep searching to try and understand and think through what are our relationships to these sort of structures of power, and what are the possibilities for self-transformation as well as social transformation, and how do we understand that dialectic?
Great. Thank you for that, Russell. So we do have some questions from the audience, from the attendees in the Q&A box there that I think our panelists can see. And there's a question about sort of liberalism and the values of working within institutional activism. There's a particular question about sort of race and geopolitics in certain ways, U.S.-China relations and anti-blackness. And there's a question about sort of within, particularly this campus, this institution, a question about kind of the current discourse, official discourse around race and anti-racism in relation to sort of other institutions on campus, or other units on campus, I should say. And so I want to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to some of these questions, maybe at their discretion, and particularly maybe thinking about Jessica and Max and Bwesigye, who we haven't really heard from recently. Perhaps if we can bring you back into the conversation, that would be great. But certainly, if anybody feels moved to speak, that would be the way to go. And we have about 10 more minutes left, so just so that you're aware of the time. Does anybody want to start? So I'm fairly aware of dead air, and I feel compelled to have to fill that air, which is really one of my many not so great traits there. But maybe maybe to sort of ask the question about about the Krinal has had a response in the box. If you want to sort of share with us your response to this question about there's a question about the increased shift towards studies on anti-racism more than engagement with studies on race and more broadly speaking, or race more broadly speaking. And the question is here, with the creation of programs on anti-racism rather than increased support, funding, hiring, et cetera, for programs and departments in Africana, Asian, Latinx, and indigenous studies, I have to wonder if this move furthers a flattening of ethnic studies and in some ways deepens the inequalities we seek to unsettle in our teaching and our research. So do you want to share with us the response?
Yeah, so I kind of spoke about how I think just having these conversations, like you said, is the first step. It is not the only step that needs to be taken in order to right all the wrongs that have been committed in the past by these institutions that have gained this privilege, that gained this power. And I think that what Amma said was that, like, we're moving towards is like anti-racism instead of just talking about race in a broader sense and creating the necessary resources and not just conversations in order for change to happen. And I think that if we stop here, it creates a false sense of security, because in some ways, like Kevin said, this is appeasing students, right? This is appeasing faculty, that there is like, change happening. But if there isn't actual tangible changes happening, then this conversation isn't sustainable. There is no real change happening, but it does create this false sense of victory. And I think, kind of going back to what I said about exhaustion, I think it is exhausting to fight every day to correct people and to educate people every day. So I think people of color kind of just take a break because they think that they've won, that there is change happening, but I don't think there's change happening. So I think that actually is detrimental and even worse than the institution not doing anything, because now there isn't anything happening, but there is a false sense there is something happening. So now no one is even fighting.
Can I ask my fellow panelist Derek a question that I think that builds on what Krinal was saying just now. So for me, one of the open questions has been about language, right? In particular, this term or this phrase, anti-racism. And I'm wondering what you make of this term, and what you think its utility. How useful is it? What is its value, right? Anti-racism. What does it mean or what could it mean? It seems to me that this term is contested. And it's also widely misunderstood, but it seems that there's to me, it's a promising term in part because of the contestation, because it's forcing us to kind of define our terms here and to operationalize, right? So I'm wondering, what do you make of this term anti-racism? Does it have any promise? And if so, what is the promise of anti-racism?
If I may say something about that, I'm personally uncomfortable with the focus on anti-racism, and I think Ama Bima has, says in the comments that, the push towards institutionalizing anti-racism centers whiteness in some way, right? So I would be comfortable if the matter that was dealt with is capitalism and therefore imperialism and neoliberalism, because again, my biases are showing. Because I believe that in the larger scheme of things, the foundational problem is capitalism, and racism is therefore, superstructure and all that. So when we then say, and then, this book that everyone has been talking about, that sort of suggests that you don't have to be anti-capitalist to be anti-racist, which then becomes the liberal sort of easy option. And then we'll be back, those will be alive anyway. We'll be back to the same point in time 10, 20 years down the road, because you haven't dealt with the root, So I believe, but again, as Professor Rickford has already stated, these institutions are part of the system. They are meant to reinforce the system. So do we do the Audre Lorde, you cannot use the master's tools to demolish the master's house, and therefore figure something else out, organize differently, figure out other ways of producing knowledge outside, the way that the university operates as a capitalist institution. I don't know, but I think there are limits to wanting to change this institution, and the types of solutions that are being proposed, like anti-racism, show the limit to what can be done within the institution. So I think if we think with the same mindset that created the problem, we are not solving the problem. We need to think with a different mindset altogether. Yeah, and as the saying goes nowadays, abolish, abolish, abolish.
Thank you for that. Does anybody else want to respond? Maybe have the last word. We're running a little short on time, but we have lots of really great comments and questions, both in the Q&A box that the panelists can see, but also in the chat that I think everybody has access to, or most people have access to. So do any of our panelists want to chime in here?
Derek, I can do my best to throw in something, unless you wanted to speak, Russell. Of course, what you're going to add is going to be miles more articulate than what I will.
Oh, don't believe that. Jessica.
There's always Jessica. Go ahead, please.
So I mean, trying to do some of this work in the department context, I've been thinking about what the term anti-racism is really doing, aside from providing us a sort of common language, offering also just a sort of buzzword that gets people interested, right? Gives them a really quick and easy sense of what the discussion is going to be about. We're talking about race and how to combat issues of race within the institution. But I mean, beyond that, I think when it begins to be used by like the university administration, for example, I think it's a very easy way to conceal non-action. It's a very easy way to satiate what it is that people are looking for. And it's a very easy way to sort of provide proof that the administration is doing the right sort of reading, right? Like you mentioned, Russell, right? We're seeing this, there's a greater comfort around more radical language, or what was or what used to be radical language, right? Around the term abolition, around the term defunding, and even a term like anti-racism, which I don't think would have found its way into the institution without a moment like this. And it's just, it makes me very skeptical, because it's like, okay, now you've found the right word, but are you actually doing the right work, right? And the language is important, but I don't trust it. I don't trust the university as a rule. And so when they start using our words, I'm just like, what are you doing really? And Bwesigye, thank you also for bringing up like Amabima's comment, which I hadn't seen, that this idea of the work around what is anti-racist is usually, you know, with whiteness at the center. And like one of the biggest examples that I always bring up is the way that they teach, like teaching, right? Pedagogy, right? There's always a training about like how to deal with diversity in the classroom. And it's like, okay, but what happens when I'm the diverse presence in the classroom, right? How do I cope with that? How do I cope with the resistance of my students not wanting to hear about Black feminism, not wanting to hear about Latinx issues, right? And wondering, you know, how is this real literature? I mean, why do I have to deal with that, you know? So what is the university doing to really sort of improve the culture around, at the university, around people of color being a presence here, more than just the goal being people of color are presence here? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Jessica. That's really great. Russell, did you want to just chime in real quick?
Yeah, just, you know, briefly, so I think it's a fascinating, it's an important conversation. It's interesting to me because, again, you know, having been on the planet just a few years older than some of my other panelists, you know, I came to the language of anti-racism from the left, right? In fact, that was always a term that was used on the left, particularly among folks who were trying to engage in a race class analysis. You know, again, some folks came to use the term racial capitalism to try and encompass the sort of historic and contemporary elements of these crises, and the ways in which people lived the realities of class exploitation and racial subjugation simultaneously, to say nothing of gender. There's no question that there is an attempt there's a kind of a liberal anti-racist project, as has been mentioned, right? This kind of self-help approach to anti-racism, which it kind of individualizes it and makes it all about behavior. And then we can have this sort of conversion experience and then embody a kind of racial enlightenment that has nothing to do actually with structural racism. But for me, you know, anti-racism was all about confronting a kind of post-racial discourse that said that, well, you know, since the civil rights movement, particularly in the United States, since the civil rights movement, that, you know, we've basically, the question of racial inequality has been settled, right? That we're post-racial now, right? And this sort of discourse reached its zenith under Obama. And in fact, he helped to perpetuate it and certainly benefited from it. So anti-racism was all about, again, exposing structural racism. So I think just because it's contested now by liberals, or it's claimed or it's co-opted by liberals, doesn't mean we necessarily have to reject it out of hand. I mean, I think that in part our disdain is for this sort of diversity and inclusion industry, right? This entire regime devoted to the management of difference, or which actually has been a really critical strategy for subverting mass movements, for subverting struggles for genuine racial justice and racial transformation and genuine sort of redistribution of power and resources that these grassroots movements, by the way, that begun that drew upon the strength of the community, that drew upon the strength of popular struggles, not just in the United States, but of course, decolonization movements, liberation movements around the world. So I think that we have to be very clear about naming the diversity and inclusion regime as a real enemy in some ways, as a way that, as a force that sort of consumes resources and energy and transmutes this insurgent politics into a politics of representation or into symbolic politics. But I'd like to see us sort of think about the real transformative possibilities of the current manifestations of anti-racism and anti-capitalism, and not see those as mutually constitutive and not see them at all as dichotomous. I mean, I think it's important that practically the entire world has been in revolt in recent months, right? I mean, this is a global struggle. And as someone who has spent much of my life trying to promote an anti-capitalist politics and anti-imperialist politics, while not neglecting the struggle against white supremacy, and in fact trying to understand the ways in which these struggles are absolutely combined, must be combined. Again, like what are the possibilities for transformation in this moment? And what does it tell us when the struggle against racist policing, the struggle against violent white supremacy becomes the cutting edge of a larger struggle, right? I mean, we've this is not the Black Lives Matter struggle narrowly conceived has not been the only grassroots insurgency of our time. We've seen all kinds of rank and file struggles. We've seen wildcat strikes, et cetera, et cetera. But there's been a convergence around anti-racism. So look, I'm not arguing for anti-racism as a term. I'm arguing for a politics that confronts the whole apparatus of oppression and brings us to the kind of transformation that some of my esteemed colleagues here on the panel have been envisioning, right? How do we shift the balance of power? How do we expand the horizon of possibilities? I think that's the critical question for our time.
Great. Thank you for that, Russell. I'm super conscious of the time. We're now at 1:37 Eastern time, according to my clock, which tells me that we've run over a little bit, and I want to be conscious, particularly of the great work that Ashley has done to help pull us together at a kind of logistical level. So I really want to extend my thanks to Ashley's hard work with this, to the Institute for Comparative Modernities, to Shelley Wong in particular for really being the leading light on this. And of course, to everybody who's attended, for the 61 of you who are still hanging in there with us, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. But obviously, especially to the incredible range of voices and commitments, and the depth of the commitment and the work that our panelists have been engaged in, and for sharing that with us this afternoon. So thank you so much. And I really do hope, I share the hope that this is the beginning of a much deeper conversation as we move forward. So and not just conversation, action, right? So thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks to the students and thanks to ICM. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was that was really wonderful. And I wish we had another hour and a half, frankly. And I apologize for it being a little less smoothly run than perhaps I would have liked, and not having a huge amount of time to hear from many of the people who attended the panel. But I really appreciate everybody taking the time out of with their day off, right? Or the students' day off, maybe not for the rest of us. Right, today is a fall break day, a single day. And it's actually nice out in Ithaca. So those of you who are lucky enough to be in Ithaca can enjoy the sun at least.
No, thanks so much, Ashley and Shelley and Derek. I thought it was very, very useful conversation. And actually with a lot of panelists, I thought that we got a lot of voices in. So yeah, I think it's a success.
Yeah, and how to continue it. I mean, several people have talked about sustaining, and not just sustaining conversation, but moving into praxis of one sort or another. And I just wanted to just say very briefly on the question of language that matters, on anti-racism. And like you, Russell, I come out of a different history or an earlier period where that meant something that was a matter of contestation and struggle. And the sort of displacement of anti-racism as a project, the displacement by multiculturalism first and then diversity, just takes power out of the equation altogether. Because the institution as institution, which is predicated on regularity and stability, cannot admit or incorporate or allow for that discussion. Right? And I think for all the ways in which the phrase, the term can be co-opted into